Welcome to the following Parenting Special Needs Magazine podcast. I'm Shantae, the founder and publisher of Parenting Special Needs Magazine. We created this podcast to uplift, educate, and celebrate you. We're so glad you're here, so let's get started. Hi, welcome to Parenting Special Needs. I'm Shantae, and in this purposeful conversation, we're addressing a very important topic. In today's digital age, children are exposed to sexualized content more than ever. And for parents, especially those raising children with special needs, teaching healthy sexuality and boundaries and safety is more crucial than ever. Joining us today are Dr. Susan Kaufman and Dr. Amy Morrison, who will share insights on how parents can navigate these challenges, initiate age-appropriate conversations, and empower their children to make safe, informed choices in our increasingly sexualized culture. Dr. Kaufman and Dr. Morrison, welcome, and thank you for being here today. We really appreciate it. And Dr. Kaufman, could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you, Shantae and Michelle, for inviting us to do this podcast with you today. This is such an important topic, and there's so much need for this information. So I'm an obstetrician gynecologist who specializes in pediatric and adolescent gynecology, and I work for Virtua Health in Southern New Jersey.
Okay, welcome. Dr. Morrison, will you share with us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. And again, thank you for having me as well. I am a pediatric adolescent gynecologist, and I currently practice at Weill Cornell Medicine in New York City.
Well, thank you both for joining us. I thought I would start by sharing a little something that recently came up that I heard about and I want to share. I'm going to read the little story that I have. The situation is Amy and her son, he goes to public school. He goes to school, but it's an autism setting school. And then he goes to an aftercare program. And he was talking to a little girl next to him, and he said a phrase like, "I'm going to tickle your gorilla," and then proceeded to tickle her in her private area. And that was above the pants, and it wasn't a public place. Like, staff was all around. It wasn't private. It wasn't, anything. It ended up that the young man who has autism was suspended. But because this was his first offense, they only suspended him. They didn't kick him out of school. But his mom said that he is still taking baths with his little sister, and she never realized when she should talk about private parts and things like that. So she didn't. And I don't know if he's 7 years old. And the other part of this is that there's something going around on TikTok. I'm not aware, but there's something about gorilla, meaning kind of private parts down there that are a little bit more hairy. I don't know the right way to phrase it, but Now, the other part of this is that with watching YouTube and things like that, things pop up. And could that have exposed? Anyway, there's just a lot to unpack in this. But anyways, that's an example I want to talk about and go into more detail. And then Michelle also has a real life example. So we'll probably have to share a little bit about these again. But these are what we want to talk about to start with. Go ahead, Michelle.
So I learned about a situation that happened in a school. And what happens in this school is they have volunteers who are just a couple years older than the students. And they would be the neurotypical volunteers to the neurodiverse students. So it was on one of their outings when it was reported from the volunteer older student that one of the young ladies was flirty, touchy, shaking her hair, touching, rubbing shoulders. And it kind of made the student very uncomfortable. So he reported it, which was great. And the proper steps were taken to inform the parents. But the question is, at the age this young lady was, what teaching can we offer to the parents? What should have been done? Because you should not be at the age where this has not been addressed, the safety factor, because, of course, this is an inappropriate thing. So obviously, it's certain with Shantae's topic and my topic that sexuality, sexual safety, the sexualized world really does need to be talked about sooner. And then I guess it is asking you, can you give us your thoughts on these examples and what you would offer to parents in terms of teaching and guidance?
Well, with your story, Shantae, it reminded me that on Saturday Night Live 50th anniversary special the other night, they actually did a skit that included that terminology.
Really? I missed
Yes.
it. Okay.
So I don't
Wow.
know what's going around on TikTok, but I can tell you that it was referenced in a skit on Saturday Night Live the other night. So I don't know if that young person was watching the show with their parent or they might have heard someone else talk about it. You know, talking about human sexuality is something that really should start from ages 2, 3, 4 years of age for all children, you know, children with and without special needs. And the problem is that we have a culture that has problems talking about sexuality, and parents don't receive the education. They don't get a manual on how do I talk about this with my kids and what age do I start talking about it. And so that's part of the problem. We're hesitant to talk about it. We don't know how to start talking about it. And it really should be started at a much younger age than even waiting for this to come up in the school programs.
I agree completely. And I think that there are ways to teach children from a very young age and in a way that's very appropriate for them to understand. So, for example, I would start with a young child, again, around 3 or 4, just like Dr. Kaufman mentioned, just about defining what a private part is. So that could look different for girls, for boys. Once they've established what a private part is, then I think it's really appropriate not to sexualize the private parts, but to talk about who and where and when is appropriate for those areas to be touched. So, for example, also going into what is public versus private, who is allowed to see those areas, who's allowed to touch those areas, and what to do if someone touches those areas in a way that feels inappropriate.
Right.
So that can look something like, where do you think your private parts are? Saying the breast, the underwear area. And I think another thing that's really important is to actually use anatomic terms. So even though gorilla is trending at the moment, which I wasn't aware of, it's much easier if parents start with actually anatomic terms for the person they're talking to, for adult providers, for doctors to know what area they're referring to. Once that's been established, you can say, what would you do if a stranger, for example, tried to touch that area? Would you stay? Would you go? Would you keep it a secret? Or would you tell somebody? And I think those are very basic things that people of all ages, developmental stages can understand.
Right.
I just want to pipe in 1 second when you were saying the private parts, because this is something I like to share about because I learned it years ago. And I think it's really important because no one ever mentions it. So since you guys are in a position to also educate others, is the mouth is a private part. Never thought about that before, but I mean, until I was introduced to it by a person that had written a book about body safety. And she mentioned that. And I thought, wow, that is something, because children don't think necessarily that that's a private part. We talk about what's under the bathing suit or what's covered by a bathing suit. Sometimes we never mention that. So anyways, I'm just bringing that up so that whoever's listening can also glean that information because I think it's important. So
I think I like your point, Dr. Morrison, about how you said, and what do you do if it happens? Because so many of our community, our young people, they don't advocate well. Self-advocacy is not a real good, has to be taught. So giving verbiage and letting them know if this happens, then do this is, I think, starting to teach those life skills that I think make the difference that early on.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's never wrong to say something or to ask. And I think there's a lot of teaching about trusting intuition. And if something feels right or something feels wrong, which can be hard to develop, but I think that's why starting at a very young age, 3 or 4, even earlier than you think so, can be helpful in developing that intuition over time.
Right. And I think it's important to stress to parents that you build on this information. You don't dump it all out there at one time for a 3 or 4-year-old, because first of all, we don't want to scare them. We want them to understand what we're talking about, and we want them to accumulate this knowledge over time. So that's really important to stress to parents. And like you said, starting to talk about body parts and using proper terms. So we're not sexualizing a body part. Because if you call breasts titties or you call the vulva some other slang term, you are sexualizing those body parts. And what we want children to understand is that these parts are normal, important parts, and we want to use the correct terminology. And then we want to build on that to say, okay, Well, the reason we call them private parts is because, and then build on that lesson. And this young man that you were talking about, who's 6 or 7 and still taking a bath with his sister, well, you want to educate parents about when it's time to separate that. When do you not put 2 children in a bathtub together? When do you not dress them together? When do you encourage them not to run around naked in the house because they have siblings of the opposite sex, without scaring them and without making them shamed about their bodies? So we have to be really careful not to shame them when we're talking about this too.
So is there an appropriate time? Like, is there something out there that's like, this is the appropriate time? I mean, when they start asking questions or?
Well, I think, yeah, when young children start noticing using siblings as an example, start noticing their siblings' private parts. Oh, well, what is that? I don't have one of those. And, he has a penis and I have a vulva or a vagina. And you start explaining the differences. And when they start noticing it, I think quietly separating, not saying to a child, oh, you cannot bathe with your sibling anymore because, or you cannot run around naked in the house because. We don't want to give them that message, but we want to quietly and calmly start separating them as we're talking about these subjects. As an example, I have 3 children. All my kids are 2 years apart. And I used to bathe them together. But when the middle son started becoming interested in the older son's penis, about 2 or 3, oh, look at that. I can grab that. I can pull on that. Okay, that's time for conversation and separation, education, but not shaming.
And I think that's really important, the not shaming part. I think the worst thing that could happen is to not address this at all. The second worst thing is to shame somebody, because as they're learning, if you associate these kinds of questions, these kind of behavior with shame, then over time, they may feel shameful. They may feel hesitant to go to somebody to ask questions. They may feel hesitant to report it. And so it makes me sad that that child was suspended and punished and made to feel shame about something that was likely something that they weren't yet aware of that was inappropriate or made the other person comfortable. So I think as parents, the best thing you can do is not judge, not have a negative reaction when children ask questions, and to really just maintain an open and honest attitude and really normalize the privacy of one's body, but also the exploration and sexuality as they get older too. Because what we don't want to have happen is that children don't feel safe going and reporting something uncomfortable, or don't feel safe asking about changes in their body. So I agree that avoiding shame is really important.
So it's a building process starting at those young ages and teaching about private parts. And you can have that conversation off and on through childhood. You can reinforce why we call these parts of our body private parts and who can touch our private parts and who cannot. When I have a young girl in the office, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I have to do an external genital exam, I have to check her vulva. The first thing I do is show her pictures, explain what's going on down there, and explain why these are private parts and who should look at them and who shouldn't, and who can touch them and who can't. So I do that even before I do a checkup. And then I ask permission, because part of my explaining is saying to them, I do need to check you because you're complaining about itching, and that would be the best way for me to figure out how to help you. But I also need you to give me permission to check you so that we are all on board with what's going on. And so that's how I approach it in the office. And I think having more written material for parents to read as their kids age would be really helpful to say, like you said, when do I talk about this? How do I talk about this? And move up through the ages. Using your example, Michelle, that you were talking about, the teenager, whether somebody has special needs or neurodivergences, or whether they're verbal or nonverbal, they're going to experience the same sexual feelings as anybody else. And it's important for the parents and the pediatricians and the gynecologists and the people in school to help those young folks understand at the level they can understand what they're feeling, and then how to channel those behaviors, how to handle those behaviors.
Thinking of permission, that reminds me of something else that's really important, which is consent. And that can be taught from a very, very young age. And I think having taught consent could potentially avoid things like, in both examples, of inappropriate or unwanted touch. So I feel like this can be categorized from an early age too, about what types of people and what types of touch. So, for example, strangers, never okay for any kind of touch, unless there's some form of consent. So, may I shake your hand? May I hug you? Another category could be acquaintances, family, friends. Even with those people, touch is great. You can hand hold, you can shake hands, you can fist bump, but those also require consent. May I hug you? May I shake your hand? And then more private types of touch. So as people get older and develop those same feelings that all people experience, whether that's attraction, arousal, things like kissing, intimate touching, those require consent as well from both parts. And I think a really good way to approach that from even a young age is asking about other areas of consent and other areas of control over one's body. For example, you get to choose what you want to put into your body to eat, right? You can say yes or no to what you eat. Do you control what type of clothes you want to wear? You can say yes or no. So the same thing, if someone wants to hold your hand, if someone wants to kiss you, if someone wants to touch you on the shoulders, you're allowed to say yes or no. And so that, I think, just kind of bridges the gap between touch and other types of consent in children's lives.
I think that's really important.
Yeah,
It is, because
that's a great point. Because even kissing, you were talking about the mouth as a sexual organ. Well, we want to be very clear about, our mouths are important for eating, our mouths are important for talking, but then there are times when our mouths may want to touch somebody else, and explain about that and about whether that's appropriate, not appropriate, consent from the other person. Do you want to kiss somebody on the lips? If it's your parent, do you kiss them on the lips? Do you kiss them on the cheek? And how do people kiss you? So we have to make that clarification as well.
I think the part about consent I love, because you can teach that when the relatives come for the holidays. It's always like, go give them a hug. Well, maybe they didn't want to give that person a hug. And maybe they haven't seen them for a year, but we're like, oh, go hug that. But consent can be taught without teaching it sexually. It can teach that it's an important thing starting there. And I think that's a good way.
And I think it's important overall, because I know I'm a hugger and a toucher, which I've kind of become more aware of. Like, you have to be aware of that just in general. So like, let's say if I'm at church or something, I would always hug everybody. But I started like now being more aware. And do you mind if I hug you? Because, some people don't like it and they don't want to be touched. Right. And whether they're older, younger, whatever. So it is a matter of just asking, right?
I mean, changing your brain from thinking that, I'm going to just touch that little baby's foot. No, we're not going to be doing that. We're going to ask the parents. So consent is really huge. And it's a mindset, I think, that you have that we can teach.
Yes.
Exactly.
And we can teach it without fear. So we have to teach it in a non-biased way, but absolutely start at a younger age.
So like back to that example of relatives, instead of saying, go give your aunt a hug, saying, would you like to give your aunt a hug? And if they say no, or the aunt says no, it's also okay to say no too. So there's also, again, that very neutral to positive reaction of they're allowed to say no. And I think that translates to when they're older. If you feel attraction to somebody, if you want to kiss somebody, you may want to. That may feel nice to you. It's okay if they say no too. Consent goes both ways. So I think, again, like avoiding that shame piece, avoiding that fear-based piece.
Right. And actually, I just thought of another point. If we tell a child, oh, go give your aunt a hug, and that child doesn't want to, but we keep forcing the issue, then we're giving a sublime message to that child that you don't have control over what you do or what somebody does to you. So we have to be mindful of helping other people in the room to understand, especially if they say, well, my grandson won't give me a hug. What's wrong? Well, we have to explain to that person. So it's teaching everybody.
It's almost like teaching them to not have to please,
Yeah.
which I think gives them that sense of self and strength.
Which I think it's kind of hard with the special needs population because their whole, like they're with therapists, they're always trying to please someone, their teachers, maybe in my household, it is that way anyway, but they don't stop. As you guys were speaking, I was thinking about in a bowling alley situation where my daughter's on a team and one of the young ladies, they're adults, but she thinks she should hug her and kiss her after every bowling thing. And I had to pull her aside and say, listen, this is not socially acceptable behavior. Now, I didn't say it to the girl, I said it to my daughter, but my daughter was just trying to make her happy. So she didn't know what to do. So I think, again, pleasing, they don't understand all those things.
And that's, I think, too, where it's really important to talk about these things, as uncomfortable as they may be in general to talk about, much less with our children, because we know that people with special needs are more susceptible to things like sexual abuse. And so, talking about it is the best thing that we can do to prevent it to begin with.
Right. Unfortunately, folks with special needs are often really dependent on a large group of caretakers. And so there is invasion into the personal space. There is often help with bathing, with dressing. Mm-hmm. If somebody isn't toilet trained and they could be, 13, 14, 15 and still wearing diapers, somebody's changing their diapers, somebody's wiping them. And so there's a lot of breakdown of intimacy barriers. And so the education has to be for everybody, the people taking care of our special needs folks and our special needs folks, so that they understand there are still boundaries, even though they may need a lot of physical care. Somebody who's wheelchair bound, somebody who needs help with bathing and so forth. And because of those breakdowns, they are at much more risk for sexual abuse by somebody who may be a known caretaker, but may be a predator.
Are there any resources that you are aware of, or either one of you are aware of, that parents might be able to access? I mean, is there anything that you've come across? I know you also have written a book. I want to hear about that in a minute too, but I don't know if that pertains exactly to this, but maybe it does.
There are a lot of resources online. And what I like to do is I'll either write a handout for my patients or I will get websites for them, which I was so excited to see your website because it has so much wonderful information.
Oh, thank you.
To find a list of websites for parents to say, you need support, you need education, and here's some good places you can go to read about how to talk to your children, how to protect your children, how to talk to the people in your children's environment.
Yeah, and there are thankfully, many books, including illustrated books for younger kids about what is consent, what is a vulva, what is a normal body part. So if it feels uncomfortable to kind of bring these things up spontaneously, there are books that you can incorporate into your bedtime book routine that just addresses these. And then as you're going through it, you can also ask if your kid has any questions about it. Does this make sense? And I think those also show, thankfully, a lot of diversity. So people with and without special needs are included in these books. So they're really excellent too.
Yeah. Oftentimes people with special needs are considered to be asexual. So nobody envisions them having sexual thoughts, sexual desires, going through the same hormonal issues that teenagers without disabilities have. And nobody envisions them growing up to be sexually active. And so we have to get rid of that stereotype because that inhibits conversation and it inhibits education. And I've had many special needs young women who do end up being in relationships, being sexually active, even getting married. And if we can't talk to them about this, we also can't talk to them about protecting themselves in those relationships and safe relationships and non-abusive relationships. So we have to get rid of that stigma that they are asexual. And we have to stress the fact that they are having exactly the same sexual feelings as every other teenager. And they're just maybe not knowing how to express them. I had one patient that I took care of who never had a male teacher. And she got into middle school and she had a male teacher. And of course, she's going through hormone changes and experiencing all the things her peers are experiencing. So she would walk into class and she would lift her shirt up every day to show her teacher her breast. Now, there was no malicious motive going on there. She didn't have a total understanding of what she was doing. She just thought it would be cool to show him. So they came to me for counseling and how to remedy the situation. And I was able to talk to the young lady about it, talk to the parents, get a therapist involved, get more education going. Eventually, they did take her out of his classroom, but that wasn't the solution. The solution was education and why that was not appropriate and what was happening around her doing that.
I think that too comes up a lot when children are getting older and maybe exploring their bodies a little bit. They maybe feel sensations that they're unable to explain or that they're unable to feel reassured about. So I've had patients, for example, who are feeling sensation in their clitoris for the first time, for example. And they really explore that by doing things like rubbing against furniture or maybe even doing things that would be inappropriate in front of other people. And it's normal. Of course, all those things and those sensations are normal, but it is really uncomfortable to talk about. So I think if parents don't feel comfortable, it sounds like your patients, Dr. Kaufman, did the exact right thing. You're always welcome to bring your child to a doctor to help facilitate that conversation and problem solve together.
Right. Right. So pediatricians are definitely a first line in encouraging parents to have these conversations, providing resources. The school should be a lot more involved. Sometimes parents feel like they need to take their kids out of the sexual education classes in school. And I think in many cases that is a big mistake, that they should be part of those classes. You know, starting in 4th or 5th grade when the school nurse comes in to talk about periods and pads and all of that, on into education in high school where they're talking about contraception and they're talking about sexual behaviors. Now, of course, there are some children that can't be part of those classes, but most can, and they should be. And again, it's getting rid of that stigma about, oh, we don't talk about this because our child shouldn't know about this or our child's not interested in this.
As a parent of 2 young ladies, I think we've done the talking, but I think sometimes what I will think we did, if we have a neurotypical and then we have our special needs, our 27-year-old who has special needs, we did the conversation and then I think we always allowed questions, but never did we consistently bring it up to where, like you're saying, you build on it. And I think that's like what I'm taking away from this is the importance of starting young, opening the conversation, and then keeping it going and adding whatever is appropriate at the time. But you've built the base of saying it's an open conversation as opposed to here's what's going on. And, you know, yes, you can ask the questions. And so I love that for the families because that's going to start it. And I think that's where then the trust is built that they know it's okay to ask. Right. And as situations come up, you address them, but you're not starting, you know, from square one, nor are you starting and leaving the conversation for them to bring up.
Right. Okay. So as you guys are saying this, my little head's going, and I don't know if I've ever actually had the conversation about sex with my daughter, because with my daughter that's 28 with special needs. I mean, yes, I've brought up like body parts and safety and all that kind of stuff, but I never really did go into the total anything like that because I think she would perseverate on it and then I don't know what I would end up with. So I guess I'm afraid. Yeah. So is there any, I'm sorry to be honest, but that, like, as you guys were saying,
no, that's great.
God, I don't think I've ever had this real conversation. I mean, I've talked about different things and private parts, nobody touches you, all that kind of stuff. But I have never like actually gone into, I mean, I might have said babies come from here, you know what I mean? Like that kind of stuff and explained that, but I've never
talked about sex.
I've never talked about sex with her. And so is there a book for that? Because, and then should I bother? Or, I mean,
No, but that's the sequel people want me to write about. And
oh,
I'll mention my book in a second, but I have a question for you. Does your daughter ever talk about having a boyfriend?
she has a boyfriend.
Okay.
But
And
yeah, so it's kind of limited. They talk on the phone and they kiss on the lips, and there's not very much time that they're alone totally together ever. So that's kind of their relationship. I mean, they talk on the
Okay.
phone and they see each other and kiss. And
okay. Is her boyfriend also have some
Yes.
special needs?
yes,
Okay. And have you spoken to his parents about what they've told him?
I have not.
Okay. So sometimes
Yes, so see, conversations. Okay.
that's a good place to start to find out what he's been told. And then because your daughter has a boyfriend, it actually makes it easier to bring up the conversation than if she didn't, because you can sit and talk with her, about, are you guys kissing and how does that feel to you? And how does that make you feel? And do you want to kiss your boyfriend? And then you can build on, where is that happening? Is it happening in the privacy of their room when they're visiting each other? Is it happening in public when people aren't paying attention?
No, that's not allowed. They're not allowed alone together. Sorry.
Okay. So you have to kind of explore that. Does she want to kiss him, and how does it make her feel? And how does he approach her when he wants to kiss her or she wants to kiss him? And where is it happening? So that you can kind of channel those behaviors, make sure it's happening in a safe place. It's not unreasonable for them to have some monitored privacy, we call it. And then, you just kind of continue on. Well, how would you feel if he touched your shoulder? How would you feel if he wanted to touch your breast? So slowly you can build that conversation.
Okay, I'm going to. It's so I wasn't planning on getting into this. Oh my gosh. Okay, guys.
Okay.
Wow.
I do love that we're talking about this, though, because there is a difference between a sexual relationship and a romantic relationship, and they can often overlap. I think there's a lot of stigma, like Dr. Kaufman mentioned, attached to the sexual relationship. But one of the beautiful things about talking about this and being open to talking about intimacy with kids with special needs is that they can go on to develop those romantic relationships and those companionships, which I think is a beautiful thing.
I love that you said that. You just made me feel calmer, because I thought I can address that area and kind of make it a romantic, whatever, not sexy.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I've had special needs folks move in with each other and have an apartment and build a life together. So depending on where our special needs person is at in terms of their development, these are things that are not out of reach for a lot of people.
Well, is there anything else? I mean, I know we've taken a lot of your time, so I appreciate everything. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to say or share about that we didn't address that's important that we need? I know there's a lot of important topics that we need to get out on this. Anything that, Amy, do you want to go?
Sure. The thing that I'm thinking of is that if there's any concern for sexual activity, if there is any desire for sexual activity, again, that's different from romantic relationships. But if there's any of that going on, one thing to also talk about and think about is contraception. So pregnancy prevention and STI prevention. So it doesn't sound like we have too much time to go into that today, but that's another really important piece of keeping people with special needs safe and avoiding pregnancy if and when that's something that they want to participate in.
Right. Absolutely. And safe sex in terms of preventing sexually transmitted infections, because somebody's partner may have been sexually active with somebody else. And we need to make sure that that person is tested, that our child is safe if they're going to go down that road.
I know, not comfortable topics, but important.
Oh,
yeah.
Sure.
Not comfortable, but so important.
I know it's so. Oh, yes. Oh, gosh.
And also, again, preventing sexual abuse. I had one special needs young woman who was dating a guy that did not have special needs. And when I first found out about the relationship and explored the relationship, it was very clear that there was abuse going on, and he was taking advantage of her. And unfortunately, she ended up with a sexually transmitted disease. But mom was not even aware of all of this going on. And I found out when she came to my office and we started to have some private conversations. So it's really important that we focus on protecting men and women from sexual abuse by a partner. And again, talking about it all and knowing what's going on and knowing if there's consent will help prevent that. I'll just make a little tiny plug for my book.
No, I want you to, please. All right.
When you asked about how to start the conversation, well, my book is a story about a young lady with autism who goes through puberty and starts to have periods. And it's a story so that it can be easily comprehended. We have great pictures, not a lot of verbiage, because I think the pictures are more important than anything else. And a parent can take that book, and even with a 6, 7, 8-year-old, because periods are starting so much younger now, especially in girls with autism, girls with cerebral palsy, they might be starting periods younger. And they can start with the beginning of the book and talk about, oh, look, body's changing, and look what Nora's going through, and how's her, she's talking about how her body's changing. And even if you just use the first couple pages to introduce that, and then, 6 months or a year later, you see more changes, and now you bring the book back out and you talk about, okay, well, what's going to happen as a consequence of those physical changes? And you start talking about periods. Or you leave the book lying around and you let that person pick it up and look at it whenever they want to. And again, it's opening communication and it's normalizing what's happening.
Yeah, no, I love that.
It can be done with any book, but my book has great pictures.
Yeah. And you're helping us now. So we will link to it and put a cover and show everybody all of that's, where to find your book and purchase it. So that'll be great. Michelle, did you have anything else you wanted to ask before we wrap up?
No, I think you all covered pretty much everything, with the crux of it being start early and open conversations and normalize the topic.
And what I really am taking away is consent. I mean, that's everywhere. I mean, that is like a lot of parts of it. So, well, and I took away some other things, but I have to just breathe through a little.
Sorry.
Be dealing with those after
I'm gonna have to work on those, but anyway.
It was thank you all very, very much.
Yeah, thank you all very much. I can't thank you enough for sharing with us and taking the time. I really appreciate it for our audience to learn. And I think this will be very helpful. So thank you very much. We will let you know, we'll share. And for those of you that still are listening with us, thank you for tuning in. And in case no one has told you today, you are doing a great job. Be good to you, and we will talk to you soon. Bye.